Evening and welcome to the University of Tasmania's Island of Ideas talk series. And tonight it's the 2023 Sandy Duncanson Social Justice Lecture, provocatively titled with a question, Do Children Matter in Australia? And my name is Gino Delpont. I'm the Interim Dean of the Law Faculty here at the University. And it's my privilege and indeed honour to be here in the capacity of MC this evening. Now, as is our practice at the University, and it's a good practice, we commence with an acknowledgement of country. And as a reflection of our institution's recognition of the history and culture of this island, the University of Tasmania wishes to acknowledge the traditional owners of Lutruwita, Tasmania, the Palawa people. The Palawa are the original and traditional custodians of the land upon which we are broadcasting today. Nipaluna, that's Hobart. We pay our deepest respects to elders past, elders present, and those that are emerging, and indeed those who did not achieve elder status. We acknowledge the deep history of storytelling, knowledge, and sharing and caring for land. And although we've just looked at the past now, we also use that as a springboard for the future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Indigenous perspectives, culture, language, and history, and a continued effort to fight for Aboriginal justice. And indeed, that aligns with what we're speaking about today as a general topic, a question of social justice. So on behalf of the University of Tasmania, I express a heartfelt welcome to each and every one of you. It's an honour to participate in what is becoming a long-standing tradition. Both the Island of Ideas lecture series and the Sandy Duncanson Social Justice Lecture were born from tragedy. And although seeded during challenging times, they are an enduring attribute to a community of which you are a part, who rally together in support of ideas, discussions that one day may inspire action and a brighter future for each of us. Now, the Island of Ideas lecture series commenced in 2020 in a way whereby the university could connect to the community with ideas at a time that we were in lockdown. The online program continues in the hope we can continue to connect with Tasmania's community and research to people across our regions and into the global network as such. And the emergent conversations form an important part of what the university's role is about: connection, collegiality, and community. These are values that date back to our founding institution back in the 1890s. And they're values shared with this annual event's namesake, Alexander Sandy Duncanson. Now, this evening we have two speakers that I have the privilege of introducing. Leanne McLean is known to many of you. She's the Tasmanian Commissioner for Children and Young People, and she was first appointed to this role in 2018, a role that's dedicated to upholding, protecting and promoting the rights and well-being of children and young people under the age of 18 in Tasmania. Now, my notes here say that Leanne grew up in the deep south of Tasmania, later moving to Hobart, also in the south of Tasmania, but not quite so deep, where she attended a government high school and then college before studying science at the university. And my notes also indicate that while studying science, but presumably unrelated to it, she won a karaoke competition. I don't believe this evening that Leanne will be doing any singing for us, but what she will be doing, and I'm not going to preclude that if you wish, Leanne, what she will be doing is bringing a wealth of experience as a leader in social policy development, including developing, delivering and communicating policies that affect children and young people and empowering them to shape their own future. It's fitting then that, as you probably all know, that she was recently reappointed a Commissioner for Children for another 5 years. Congratulations, Leanne. We're also honoured this evening to be joined by Leanne's national counterpart, Anne Hollins, who commenced as National Children's Commissioner in November 2020. Now, before that appointment, Anne was the director of the Australian Institute of Family Studies, a statutory authority responsible for conducting research and providing advice on child and family wellbeing. Now, in this role, interestingly, Anne was actually also director of the Australian Gambling Research Centre. For more than 23 years, Anne has been a CEO of government and non-government organisations focused on research, policy and service delivery in health, education and social services. Anne also has extensive frontline experience, including child protection, out-of-home care, domestic and family violence, child and family therapy, parenting education and mental health. Thank you for joining us, Anne. Now, Leanne and Anne together are no doubt eminently qualified and I'd say ideally positioned to speak on the topic this evening, Do Children Matter in Australia, as the subject matter of the 2023 iteration of the Sandy Duncanson Social Justice Lecture. And having perused the lectures going back to their inception in 2012, this is the first occasion where there is a targeted focus on social justice in relation to children. And so to that end, I would invite both Anne and Leanne to come forward and we'll engage in some questioning. Now, I'm not here by any means as an expert. The experts are the person on the left and on the right of me this evening. And I've got some general questions that will prompt discussion and facilitate speakers going into matters in more detail by way of illustration. And just if you think, why is he in the middle? That's to make sure that these two, if they get into a fight, I can break it up. So I'm going to start with a question that perhaps sometimes almost goes unnoticed. And the question is this, and I'll direct it in the first instance to Leanne. Why is it that children are largely absent from the policy debates that impact upon them? Leanne.
Thank you, Gino. And I just want to start by acknowledging how wonderful it is to be here, to be a part of Sandy's legacy. It's wonderful to be here, and especially with you, Anne. We've been a bit of a double act today. We've done a few meetings together, so we're well warmed up. When I think about the question, I think there's two reasons, and I want to start with an example. When we first came out of lockdown nationally, when the Prime Minister announced that we were sending children back to school after weeks of lockdown in COVID, he spoke about how it was important that children, it was Scott Morrison at the time, who said it's important that we get children back to school because it's important for the workforce. It's important that we get children back to school because it's important for productivity and it's important that people can get on with their jobs. He didn't once mention that it's important for children. Similarly, in a more recent election, the topic of franking credits came up. There are a lot of middle-aged or, people in the autumn of their lives across Australia who were impacted by that franking credits policy, and my word, didn't they jump up and down. So the first reason I think children are absent is because they don't have a vote. So their views are automatically diminished or discounted because they're not front and centre in the minds of our policymakers and our decision makers. The second reason is because, by and large, those policymakers and decision makers and adults generally don't know how to include them. They don't know how to do it well. When they do it, it's tokenistic, and it actually results in children feeling disempowered and less likely to want to put their hand up and have a say or influence things.
Thank you, Leanne. I'm wondering, Anne, do you have a viewpoint on this, the absence or largely absence of children in debates in this space?
Yes, I have a view on this. Thank you. And can I just say how lovely it is to be here in Hobart, and I'm very honoured to be able to be here tonight. So, look, I get asked this all the time by people. How come we've made so little progress on children's issues, and, why is Australia lagging the rest of the world? We rank 32 out of 38 OECD countries on child wellbeing, for example. why? I get asked why. And I've asked that same question of members of parliament, because I'm trying to work it out myself. And I have been told directly what Leanne just said. I've been told, Anne, it's because there's no votes in children. That's what I've been told more than once. And so that means, children don't vote, we know that, but also it means that the children's issues do not win or lose elections. And when it comes down to it, it's about the politics. So children historically have been seen as the responsibility of their parents. And parents and families raise children, we know this. And so there's been an assumption made that somehow, someone called it a trickle-down child wellbeing. We've got this idea that it'll somehow trickle down. And to some extent that's true. So if you go to, I'm glad you raised COVID, Leanne, because during COVID there were measures that were put in place that did help families. If you remember, a job seeker was uplifted. It took masses of children out of poverty, by the way, while there was the extra job seeker supplement in place. So that showed that, in Australia, 1 in 6 children lives in poverty. You're more likely to be in poverty in Australia if you are a child. So during COVID, we lifted a lot of kids out of poverty. A lot of the other measures helped families, so therefore they helped children. But there are a lot of unique issues that children have that are not the same as adults, and we don't spend time focusing on those unique issues to children. We push them to the side, and they are effectively invisible when it comes to policy. Policy is dominated by the concerns of adults, and so what we don't have in this country, in contrast to other countries that score higher on child wellbeing in the OECD, in contrast to us, they actually put children at the centre of social policy and they address the unique needs of children. Some of them have actually changed their constitution. I know everyone's going to laugh now, but they actually changed their constitution when they signed up to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, so that the Convention on the Rights of the Child was in their constitution. Now, I know that will never happen in Australia, given what we've just all sadly been through, but we don't have any legislative base to protect the human rights of children, even though we signed up in 1990 to the Convention. So it allows us to not be accountable for children. There is no accountability, really. We can get away with not focusing on children because no one will hold us accountable at the ballot box or anywhere else. And I can, in a minute later, I'll say more about how it leads to lack of coordination as well. But just on that question of, why is it? It's all of those things. It's the historical belief that they're just children and they'll be looked after by parents. But if you say that, then the question arises, what is the role of government then when it comes to children? What is the role of government? And we don't ask that question enough. For me, the role of government is to create the conditions that support and empower parents to raise their children to be safe and well. That's the role of government. But we don't talk about that, we don't articulate it, and it doesn't drive policy. Thanks.
And we don't talk about how well our children do as a measure of the success of our society. So we talk about GDP, we talk about productivity, we talk about a range of economic measures. But if you go right back to the fundamentals of what it means to be a species here on Earth, the real measure of the success of our society is actually how well we look after the next generation. And until we have that embedded in commitment mechanisms at the state level and at the federal level, and there are a range of things that we can do, but governments generally shy away from them, we won't be able to move forward on that matter.
Can I ask there, Leanne, building on what each of you has been speaking about, you mentioned some sort of measure to see how we're, lack of better terminology, performing in the children's space. Now, we know that parliamentarians, economists and the like love the idea of a number they can compare to something else. Is there such a thing, or is this a much more qualitative type of inquiry?
Well, I think you need both. So children's views on how they're doing themselves, that sort of subjective measure, is really very important. Other jurisdictions, for example, the New Zealanders, have shown us that you can legislate targets to improve children's wellbeing. So poverty reduction targets, for example, is something that we could do. But at the state level, you know, we should give some kudos to the fact that the state government have established a policy to improve the wellbeing of Tasmanian children, and they have for the first time started measuring that, and they're measuring it from a strength space, which I understand because we don't want to always talk about the deficits. But unless you do acknowledge and talk about the deficits, it's really easy to skim over the hard stuff, like poverty, like the fact that 1 in 6, like the fact that you could buy a new coat and go to the dentist during COVID, but you can't do that anymore because they took that money away. So sorry, that was a hard end.
I just wondered if there was something more that was emerging there, so I was just waiting rather than...
I did not do that in the karaoke competition, I promise.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm just wondering, you'll be familiar, I'm sure both of you and many people in the audience, that there was a certain Prime Minister that some years ago said that there shall be no poor child by a certain date. And that certain date has long passed. Is there something here that we should be thinking about? You mentioned 1 in 6 children living in poverty, and clearly there were ideas at the time to address this problem, but those ideas for some reason lack something in implementation, or was it something else?
I can't comment on the Hawke years. I was way too young, Gina. But I don't know what the measures were then, or couldn't possibly assess their, you know, how good they were. But yes, we should have targets, right? And, you know, in Australia, we often talk about, oh, it's the Federation, you know, you can't get every state and territory to do anything. Commonwealth can't make them do it. They don't want to do it. They don't work with each other. Like, it's terrible, really. But I met with a delegation from the European Union late last year, I think it was, and they told me that they've put child poverty reduction as a number one thing. I think there's something like 127 delegates to the European Commission, they call it, and I don't know how many countries are part of it, but it's a lot, right? And they have all agreed, and it's called the National Child Guarantee. Every single country has a national plan for poverty reduction and improving child wellbeing. If you can do that amongst so many different countries with different cultures, different languages, different everything, and we can't get the few states and territories in Australia to come together and make child wellbeing a national priority, a bipartisan national priority, and to set some targets. You know, this is not easy. It's complicated. It's complex, obviously, but we've run away from that complexity and we said, oh, it's all too hard. And by the way, it's the Federation. So I think we have to see that I think we've neglected this issue in this country. You know, we worry about child abuse and neglect in the community, but I think at the government and systemic level, we have neglected our children and their well-being, and we haven't. You know, in my whole career, I've seen very little progress on the entrenched problems that are still holding us back and harming our children. And I think we need to wake up and step up as a country.
I do wonder, Gino, what would happen if a Prime Minister now said that. I reckon Anne would be on his or their doorstep within about 25 minutes.
Well, you mentioned a former Prime Minister when you were talking about COVID, who I did write to several times during COVID to, to ask him for a greater sense of urgency to have a national COVID strategy for children, because children were being ignored during the pandemic. You know, at that top table when those decisions were being made, there was no chief paediatrician there. There was no one there who had spoken to children and was able to represent their views, or even better, have a child at the table. You know, there was no one whose job it was to represent children. And I believe that a lot of the decisions that were made, I know they were different decisions in different jurisdictions, but they bypassed the unique needs of children. I'll just give one example. I'm from New South Wales. We had a 15-week lockdown, and I distinctly remember, by the way, I started this job during the lockdown, so I was in this job by then, and at the end of that 15 weeks, the pubs and the restaurants were opened, but not the schools. And one of the things we learnt during the pandemic was that schools are about much more than academic learning that can be replaced by Zoom. And the kids who missed out the worst were the kids, you know, 6 kids in one flat somewhere with one computer, with one parent, or the kids with disabilities, or, you know, the kids from poverty, the kids who are actually at risk of harm, who are not getting visited or were not noticed because they weren't going to school, so there was no child protection people to visit their families. You know, these kids missed out seriously, and we are still picking up the pieces today, and teachers and early childhood educators will talk really vividly about the losses of learning that they've seen, the social and emotional lags in the children that they work with, because school is a social learning environment and it's much more than about academic learning. This is one of the things that, so we've got a national COVID inquiry now. I don't know if you heard the media about, it's not going to deal with state-based decisions, therefore not going to deal with school closures. And I was asked about that in the media, and I always try and be positive if I can. But what I said was that I'm hopeful still that children will be addressed and children's needs will be addressed, and that there's a lot that we can learn from around the world about whether we should be closing schools in a crisis like that. Or, you know, I remember many were arguing that schools should be the last to close and the first to open. That was another way of looking at it. And now there have been reports from other parts of the world who didn't, for example, close their primary schools at all. And the outcomes, you know, now we can measure. And so I said in the media, I said, I'm really hopeful that this COVID committee, these commissioners doing the COVID inquiry, will put a spotlight on children, because Australia is a signatory to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it is our job nationally to protect their human rights. And we do have to learn from this experience so that we can avoid those mistakes going forward.
Now, I'm wondering, you mention problems, and the solution that I'm picking up in the discussion is give children a greater voice, or have somebody represent children's voices. Is that assured of securing a positive outcome, or are there so many other steps that we need to pursue?
Looking at me, Gina.
I'm looking at you.
It's dangerous. Okay, so that's a very big question. So on the positive, like I said, I try to be positive where I can. One of the pieces of progress in Australia has been there's more listening to children, actually, than there used to be. So, you know, we've got commissioners in every state and territory, and, you know, like Leanne's work is really important, talking to kids all the time and amplifying their voices to policymakers and so on. A lot of schools do it, a lot of organisations are doing it now, and I think after your commission of inquiry here recently, I think there'll be even more, because, you know, that inquiry really pointed to how children were silenced. And what we know from all the Royal Commissions and inquiries over the years is that children who are silenced are never protected. So I expect to see more of that. But what I still haven't seen, Gino, and this is where I'm on a hunt for the evidence of this, is where what we hear from children finds itself in policy or in systems reform actions. So it's not enough just to listen. That's a good start. And it is, Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that children should be listened to and their views given due weight, particularly in decisions that affect them. That's really important. It's often talked about as the gateway right to all the other 53 rights. If you're not listening to children, you've got no way in to ensure that their needs are met. It's a very important part of the convention. But we're still learning in this country on how to translate what we hear, how to ensure it shows up in policy. And I've got a collection of stories of where that hasn't happened, but I'm looking for the examples of where actually children's views, their wisdom, it's not just their experiences, their wisdom on matters, their insights, their advice, their expertise actually finds its way into policy.
There are a couple of examples, I think, in Tasmania where we're moving in a really positive direction in terms of listening to children and young people and having their voices incorporated into policy, and that resulting in action. The first is, I think we're the only jurisdiction who have developed a policy to improve the wellbeing of our Tasmanian children and young people that is largely informed by Tasmanian children and young people. And I want to circle back to the comment that I made in response to your first question, which is people largely don't know how to do it. Adults don't know how to do it. So I was asked to help facilitate the views of children into that policy, and I think there were some fairly surprised looks on the faces of key decision makers and policy makers when I said, well, I'm going to publish a book by children, for children, on what it is that they would like for their wellbeing, a children's picture book. That wasn't the type of policy input that the people I was talking to were necessarily thinking about. I think that's probably fair. But we do that type of thing in our office. We're bold. So we did it anyway. And I'm very pleased that when it was presented to the Premier at the time by the children who wrote it, he expressed to them, and we got it on camera so we can never shy away from it, that it was the most important book that he had ever read. And we now have a strategy to improve the wellbeing of our children, and it's not perfect. There are lots of gaps and there are lots of challenges in implementation which come back to the skills of our workforce and the resources that people have to implement it.
At least you have one.
We have one, and children's views are throughout. Another example is late last year, a child in care wrote to me to tell me that they no longer had access to a child safety worker, their person, the representative of the guardian, the state of Tasmania, that they had been referred instead to a team. It was called Team 7 of people with a generic phone number and a generic email address to contact them. Children in care were upset about this, and a child wrote to me to tell me that this wasn't consistent with their rights. And as Commissioner, I was able to conduct an own motion investigation into that, the results of which we will release in coming weeks, and the results are based on the views of children and others in the system, right, but the recommendations are from those children. Oh, thank you, Anne. So it's about showing people how to do it. I think there's a lack of confidence amongst policymakers around the country on how to do it.
That's fantastic. I'm genuinely impressed with some of the things happening here in Tasmania, and I think I said on ABC radio the other day that if the Premier here has promised to implement all the recommendations from the Commission of Inquiry, and when that happens, Tasmania will lead the rest of the country. So I think, again, we have to celebrate the steps forward, because that takes courage. And what you're describing there, Leanne, it takes political courage to do it differently. And what we are looking for is politicians who have that courage to step up.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to say is it's not enough, right? Listening to children, hearing them, the gateway right, is necessary, it's essential, but it's not enough. We also need commitment mechanisms that require adults to do more for children, and we need those targets. So we need the gateway right emerging in a bottom-up approach, listening to children, and we still need a top-down approach to keep children safe and protect their well-being. We need regulation, we need oversight, we need legislation with targets, we need child impact assessments. All of those things should be present.
We need to take them seriously.
Yeah. I love the clapping. It's fantastic.
Isn't it good?
It's a bit like when I won the karaoke competition. Just saying.
I'll just jump in.
You can try.
I'll try my best to jump in. I'm wondering, both of you have expressed the phrase children's views in the plural. Now, interestingly enough, we've just had a referendum where we spoke of the voice in the singular. Not voices, the voice. When you say children's views, how do you glean views, or is there a view, or are there multiple views?
Well, there's multiple views, of course, but if you talk to enough kids, you start to hear about the same thing, as I'm doing at the moment, asking them about why kids get into trouble with the police and what helps them stay out of trouble with the police or youth justice. So you talk to enough kids, you start to get some themes coming through. And, some of the themes I'm hearing are that kids steal because they're hungry, for example, or they will talk about problems in their families and the fact that their parents can't get help for drug and alcohol problems or domestic violence or mental health issues, that they steal to buy clothes. Some kids they talk about the basics, right? They talk about, they can't, there's, well, who told the story? I heard a story today about a kid getting, it was on a phone call before we came today. I heard a story of someone who got incarcerated for stealing a car in a town to get home in time for his curfew. He was on a curfew as part of his order. He stole a car to get home in time because there's no public transport in that town. Now, I'll tell you where that is. I've been there not that long ago, about 5 weeks ago, Mount Isa. Mount Isa is known as the youth crime capital of Australia, of Queensland. And I went there as part of the work that I'm doing, talk to kids and families there. And I was shocked. A town of about 20,000 people, no public transport, which means kids don't have any buses to take them to school. So if kids aren't at school, where are they? They're on the streets and they're going to get into trouble, right? It doesn't make any sense to me. Like, we're just not thinking straight, that we're all, upset about youth crime in places like that, but we don't even provide the basics in terms of the scaffolding that children and families need to raise their children to be safe and well.
Yeah. And that's really a part of our job as commissioners, is to hear those views, and there are multiple views, and then to translate them, or not even translate them, but present them and amplify them in such a way that it can influence the policy debate. It's, I think, a shame at the moment across the country that commissioners are largely charged with that. People rely on us. Everybody should be doing this to inform policy. 5 years in the job now. I've been talking to hundreds and hundreds of Tasmanian children during that time, and the same themes emerge in most conversations. Themes around, I need more support for my family. Themes around transport. I don't know how others living in Hobart are going with the transport system at the moment, but I know that I just don't feel safe with my children using it, because they're either left standing on the side of the road or they're experiencing abuse within it. It's not okay. Mental health is an enormous issue coming from children right across Tasmania in terms of access to services. Education, particularly high school. We have a serious problem with a lack of attendance and engagement. Young people are not feeling like they are a part of the education system that they're attending every day. And that's sector-wide, that's not just public education. And these are the same themes that have emerged year after year after year.
You're hearing that here, and it's amplified in international research, for example, shows that kids from low socioeconomic families are more likely to feel they don't belong at school. And I hear the same thing when I talk to kids everywhere. And we also, another statistic nationally is that 20% of 15-year-olds don't have enough reading or writing for everyday life. They just don't have those basic capabilities. So there is something wrong with our education system, the way it operates, and the fact that it's not fit for purpose for the kids who need it the most, right? And we're seeing, and the kids who end up in youth justice, they're dropping out very early, very, very early, like, you know, 8 or 9 years, probably year 7, of age, or like year 7 high school. That transition to high school, they never make it. They have learning problems, they have other barriers, and school just is not meeting their needs at all. So again, if they're not at school, where are they?
And what we know about those children in Tasmania is that, and this is a great shame, but once they are in a detention environment that is appropriately staffed, including a school, the school model within the detention environment receives really positive feedback from the young people because it is a model that caters to their needs. And for whatever reason, we have not been able to cater to those needs outside of the detention environment. And that to me is, you know, it's on its head. And it's not just education. You know, the drug and alcohol supports available for children and young people in Tasmania are non-existent at a residential level. You will literally get an opportunity to dry out with some level of supervision in detention. That is your option.
Leanne, is you've got to commit a crime.
That's right.
To get good learning, one-on-one learning support when you've got learning and other disabilities. You might have to commit a crime to get drug and alcohol help. I mean, or mental health services. That's madness. That is some kind of madness.
And I don't want to isolate Tasmania as different because this is an issue all around the country.
Oh, it is. Oh no, I hear it all the time. I talk to kids in jail and I say, do you think it helps being in here? Does it help kids to stop doing crime? And they go, well, we get food, 3 meals, that's good, and the school is better. They often say, I like the school here, but they also say, but we're learning how to do worse crimes while we're in here from the older kids. And so, again, that supports the international research that shows that the younger you lock up a child, the more likely they will be criminalised into adulthood. And we are creating a worse problem currently, the way we're dealing with youth crime.
I think we need some more time, I've got to say, because I've only got through 2 of my questions, Anne. And
we did warn him.
I was warned, but I'm going to jump full circle, as it were, to the last of my list of questions. And I'd like you to answer the why bit rather than the first bit. And the first bit was coming full circle, in which areas can we do better? Now, we've been talking about that generally, but the points related to the subject matter and the title of tonight's discussion is, why does it matter if we don't?
Well, I'll go back to the point I made a couple of comments ago, which is if we don't look after our next generation, which are also they are the proxy for future generations. We don't look after them. It should be our number one priority that they do well. You could think about that selfishly, to think, well, who's going to look after me when I need help and I'm older? You could be really selfish and individualistic about it if you want to. Or you could think about our society and what that's going to look like in 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time if we continue on the trajectory that we are on, where children's rights are not front and centre of the policy debate.
So much to be said for every question, Gina. So I'll start off by saying this goes back to your first question about children not mattering. Like, you know, as all of us, we all worked at the national level, sort of when we had a national government prior to this one, where it was more, if you like, centre-right than now. And I thought that an economic analysis argument would help. That, if we don't focus on kids, we're going to pay more later on. All the research shows that. But even that didn't work to make a difference. Even that does not work. And so I think it is those other things we talked about earlier. But why does it matter? It is the case that almost every area of adult life that is problematic, and I'm thinking here, well, the winner of the bursary talked about adult crime. There was a bit in there about Risdon. That's an adult facility,
yes.
right? And it occurred to me when that came up, that the way you prevent adult crime is you prevent these problems in childhood. Like, that's how you do it. Same with domestic and family violence, by the way. We hear, terrible, terrible statistics, even just the last few weeks alone, of so many women dying. The way you prevent adult domestic violence, you've got to start by stopping violence being experienced by children. Okay? We have that research now. So actually, they're just two examples. But, actually focusing on children is preventative of all the things that we worry about in adult life that are costly on a human and economic level. And as I said, those economic arguments have been put and they haven't been listened to, much to my dismay. And I think it's because of those, I guess, cultural, ideological things that push children to the side. But it doesn't make economic sense to ignore the needs of children, the unique needs of children. And that's why I really think that the only answer now that I can see is that each of us have to make this a political issue. Each of us has to take some responsibility to let our elected representatives know that children matter to us, they should matter to you too. We need to say that to them. We need to convince our elected representatives that they are not doing the right thing now, that it's not acceptable, that this lack of reform over decades and decades, despite innumerable royal commissions and inquiries. I was telling Gino and Leanne, I recently have been doing a project analysing 12 years' worth of royal commissions and inquiries with over 3,000 recommendations, with repeated because they're not being acted on, evidence-based recommendations. It is not okay on any level. And we as a taxpayer are paying for this in the end. So whatever way you want to take the argument, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
Now, it's not just for me to take the monopoly on asking questions. The opportunity is for everybody.
Yes, I'm really pleased to hear that you're talking about the political stuff and how important that is. What I'm wondering, I haven't heard anything about the neuroscience and the basic biology of what the mechanisms involved in creating the sort of dysfunction that you're talking about. And it would seem to me that the politics is a pretty dodgy area. But there is some very real, recent and going over the last sort of 20, 30 years of research about what actually does work that would seem to, on occasions, be talked about, but it certainly hasn't, well, I don't believe it was talked about tonight. And I think it's an area that would be really important to be looking at, particularly for those mechanisms that do build capacity for people children to be able to self-regulate in a way that keeps them out of the justice system. And I just wonder if you've got any comments about that.
Oh, thank you for raising that. Look, there's so much that we can't get to tonight. That is definitely one of them. And the wealth of evidence about early brain development, particularly, is just huge. But again, we've made some progress. at state level and at national level, recognising that there are new initiatives and so on. But it doesn't just stop at 5. You know, this is the problem. It's, you know, early childhood development, you know, quality early childhood development, both in the home and outside the home, can go an awfully long way, absolutely. But it's not an inoculation for life. If your circumstances are that your family has many generations of trauma and disadvantage and vulnerability, then you know, we need sustained support past the age of 5. And I guess that's where I'm putting my, you know, few resources, I don't have many, to try to raise attention on that, because we have made quite a lot of progress on those early years. I think that is one of the good news stories. And I know in Tasmania there are many new centres like child and family centres that really embrace you know, and encourage parents in their parenting in those early years, but also provide that the needs of the children. I think that's been a success, but I think it would be a mistake to think that that's enough. It's not enough, I think.
I completely agree, and I'll only add that one of the most effective preventative things that we can do is to prevent adverse childhood experiences in those first 1,000 days of a child's life, which is from conception to the end of their second year of life. And increasing awareness and understanding across the community around the importance of those first 1,000 days is challenging. It's something that we've been doing here in Tasmania through the B4 Coalition, and I notice there are people here tonight from that coalition, but increasing awareness of general everyday Tasmanians that in that first 1,000 days you can actually, I take Anne's point that it's not an inoculation for life, but you can overcome serious problems later in life by preventing those adverse childhood experiences early. And unfortunately, the research now at the national level indicates that, you know, maltreatment, a whole range of adverse childhood experiences are rife amongst our community. And so we're kidding ourselves if we think we've got this problem solved or we've got it right. There is an enormous amount of work to be done to educate everyday Tasmanians or everyday Australians that every interaction they have with their child, especially early in life, matters.
Add a little bit to that to say that where I think it works best is where those early childhood services integrate across education, health and social services, where we recognise that we actually make it really hard for people to get help. We make them go navigate very fragmented, uncoordinated systems that are, you know, baffling to the best of us. So they integrate them really nicely, and they're the best examples. And I know there are a number here in Tasmania. What I would like to see is that same philosophy operate in schools, that we start to see school as a public service like any other public service, and down the road there's a health service or a mental health service, there's social and family services as well, that we start to see schools as a hub that can bring in these other services and they can make it easier for people to get the help they need. There's an awful lot we can do to avoid that fragmentation that exists out there at the local level. What we also need to do is do it at the higher levels of recognising that ministers need to collaborate. There needs to be points of accountability, and one of the things I'm arguing for is at the national level we have a Minister for Children who can actually work at cabinet level with colleagues across health, education, Indigenous affairs, etc., to bring about that coordination at the top, because at the moment it's left to, you know, hard-working people at the local level to try to engineer it. I speak with personal experience here from having run one of those early childhood integrated centres in Queensland, or several of them actually, but trying to get the maternal and child health nurse to come and work out of our centre, which was run by Education Department, and took many years to enable that to happen. It didn't make any sense why the maternal and child health nurse was up the road. You know, some of these things just simply don't make sense, and siloing of services it is not meeting the needs of real people. When you look at it, it's only meeting the needs of government administrative requirements. It helps government, it doesn't help people. And we've got to flip that on its head. We've got to start to listen to people, children and parents and adults in the community about how they want their services delivered, and we've got to redesign them in accordance with what people are saying they need. These are some of I think we're inching our way to having that conversation. I mean, after this terrible period that we've just had with the Voice referendum and the really ugly stuff that came out there, one of the positives is, I think, a recognition about the need for a participatory approach, and I think that's become a more mainstream conversation now, and I think that I hope we build on that.
Thanks very much, Anne. I'm just looking online, and we have not so much a question but a request from Azra Lee, and the request is explore Ashley Youth Detention Centre, and there's something very topical for Tasmanians, although the issues are not unique to Tasmanians, and I think that, and there's also some words there, what about Tas Youth Prison? And so I know that it's something that you've got certain views upon, Leanne, so I might pass it across to you.
I've got views, Gino. The word explore is an interesting word. I think I've probably explored that facility more than most Tasmanians. I've been there many, many times. I try and visit about every 3 weeks, and since being the Commissioner, I have managed to access some additional funding out of the government to be able to employ an advocate who's here tonight. I want to acknowledge the amazing work that she does at the Ashley Youth Detention Centre. She's embedded there 3 days a week, helping me execute my legislative function to be the individual advocate for children who are there. So in exploring that, when I was in the first few years of being the Commissioner, I was there every 3 weeks. I met every child, and I thought that was a lot. Looking around other jurisdictions, the levels of access that commissioners had, the stories began to emerge. We now have a much larger presence. What I know deep in my bones is it was never enough. The fact that we rely on youth detention in Tasmania to provide our most vulnerable kids with the services that they need, or the level of service we can give them, is appalling. And I'm talking about things, universal services like accommodation and education. The fact that we have continued to do it in a facility that has had so many reviews and so many calls for closure over such a long time for purely political reasons, which are ultimately the jobs of that electorate, is appalling. It is absolutely appalling. The challenge for me in being the individual advocate for the children there is that in calling for closure, immediate closure, close it now, and I know there are so many people who want to close it now, we may inadvertently be walking further over the rights of the children who are there. So I want it closed, but I don't want it closed at the expense of the rights of the children who are there. I want something better as soon as possible. Many of these children are only there because they need food, they need education, they need clothes, they need accommodation. It is still the case in Tasmania that you can remand a child to detention because they have nowhere else to go. Many of them can be housed in the community, but what we don't have are access to places in the community where they can be safely housed and looked after, and that is what we have to make sure we get as soon as possible. And this is where collaboration between the community sector and the government is absolutely crucial to making it happen. Because too often, when I'm advocating for a child to exit the Ashley Youth Detention Centre because it's in their best interests to be in the community, there is nowhere for them to go. And that child can be under a care and protection order. They can be under the guardianship of the state. So when a child looks at me in detention and says, "What's this business about closure? Where am I going to go?" that automatically puts me in a very difficult position, because I want a better system. I want a system that looks after the rights and well-being of our children, but I also have a role to advocate for that individual child right there, right now. And that is what I have found in the last 5 years to be the hardest part of this job. It has been misrepresented publicly and in the media as me being somebody who is protecting the way things currently operate. That is absolutely not the case. What I'm protecting are the rights of those children, and I don't want anybody walking all over them.
Thank you, Leanne. You're certainly very passionate.
I am. I mean, I've learned more about resilience and tolerance and respect from the children at the Ashley Youth Detention Centre than I think I've learned from anyone else I've ever met in my life. These kids have faced extraordinary challenges, things that I could not even imagine in their short lives, largely due to circumstances that were well beyond their control, and a lack of access to services for their families that, had they had them, they wouldn't be there in the first place.
Thanks, Leanne. We have a question just here before us.
Thank you, Susan. Westcott's my name. I'm a retired social worker from psychiatry with a history of working in the community to develop a service called Child Safety Task Force in Launceston, which was a community-based service to offer parents and teachers and the community safer ways to support children who were at risk of family-based accidents. That led me to understand what is known as the public-private split, which, Anne, you've just been talking about, and the limitations within the budgets of each department, each ministerial responsibility within Tasmania and within the federal system. This is the basic problem with the delivering of services. No department has a responsibility for children, and they end up going into hospital from an unsupported area such as the home environment, and then they become a very expensive commodity. They are seen as something that is to be considered counting as an economic cost. This has to stop. We have to have a value for children, and we have to have it independent and held in our hearts as community members. We have to step up to this, because this is our future, as Leanne was saying. Without this, we are not going to get a future we want to be part of. I wonder if you could talk now about how to make politicians accountable to the bean counters who are in justice, who are in Treasury, who are still making decisions over the lives of children in this public-private sphere, which is inappropriately determined by historical events.
Well, that is the big question, isn't it? How to do it. And as I said before, I mean, when I came into this job in 2020, you wouldn't think I'd be so naive at such a great age, but I was. I kind of thought, oh, well, I'll just explain it to them. You know, I just show the data, or I don't know, explain it better than my predecessor or something. I don't know. That's what I thought. And to find that they don't want to know. They actually don't want to know. It's too complicated, because politicians like things simple. They want to know what's the one thing we can fix, or what's the one program. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, show me a program that will reduce youth crime that we can do everywhere. You know, like it's got to be simple, and that they can deal with. But we're talking about something that is very complex. So I, have a bit of empathy for them. It's complex. It's hard to do. And they're worried about the next election, okay? So they're very sensitive to what the public thinks. So that's the clue. We've got to, as the public, show them that this matters, that it's not okay. And I mean, I guess you did that here in Tassie. That's probably why you ended up with a commission of inquiry.
It is.
I don't know the details of that, but I'm guessing that somehow someone made it such a big issue that they had to have a commission of inquiry, and now you've got some things that you can implement, and the Premier has said that they will. So that shows you that that does work. But what you've now got to do is hold them accountable for what they've promised. That's right. And that's where, you know, you don't just have an inquiry, you've got to make sure there is action on the ground, evidence-based action on the ground. And, you know, you referred to the sort of work that you've done in the past. And I'll just revert to just one thing that came to mind when you were speaking, Leanne, as well. I'll link to that, you know, we do have a big responsibility. So you mentioned that some of these kids are wards of the state, and yet there's nowhere for them except Ashley, you know, like that's where they end up. So this is one of the things that upsets me, is that kids who can't live at home and the state steps in and they become under the guardianship of the state. So the state is the guardian, and then the state becomes the jailer. Mm. And we've got to call that out. We've got to call out that we are accepting we've got to also look at ourselves and go, we are accepting this. We are accepting that we are, you know, that 10-year-olds can be incarcerated in most places in this country still. That despite all the scientific evidence about brain development, going back to what you were saying before, the fact that brains are not fully developed till you're about 25. We tolerate this. It's us. Actually, the problem is us, ladies and gentlemen, not the politicians. We get the politicians we deserve. Someone famously said that. And so we've got to look at what are we doing differently and how are we valuing children at the core of our society.
Mm. And the Commission of Inquiry here was absolutely driven by people who have had experiences in the Tasmanian system of abuse that has been abhorrent. It was driven by people and by their interaction with the media to bring the stories to light, to drive change, to increase the focus on children. And some of those people who are involved in doing that will be listening tonight. It demonstrates the extraordinary power of people who care enough to drive change, be brave and make change. And we now have 191 recommendations here in Tasmania. 191, that's a lot. And we are going to need equal bravery and determination to make sure they're implemented in a way that is right. We shouldn't be ticking a box here. We shouldn't be ticking boxes. We should be doing it really, really well.
And can I just say one more thing on that? I recently spoke at an early childhood educators conference, and there was it was like 2,000 people in the convention centre in Adelaide. It was just completely overwhelming. And I was asked the question, what can we do? What can we do about this? And I didn't really have a pat answer for that, but I said, look at you. You know stuff. There's 2,000 people here in that case, but there's, you know, a lot of people here tonight too. Many of you know stuff that the politicians don't know. You know because you've worked in this field. You know stuff, by the way, that your neighbours might not know. And I think there's power in our own hands to spread the word, to make this an issue with momentum in the public.
Thank you, Anne. We are going to have to extend this session till 10 o'clock this evening, because I noticed there's quite a number of questions online, and there's
Just
also people
up.
that have extended their hands for the purposes of this room here.
Thank you, and I can totally relate to you. My name's Sue Hickey. I was a politician, and in 2018 I found myself in a party that told me there were no votes in homelessness. They believed in being tough on crime, including on children, and it was a very NIMBY culture in Tasmania where we couldn't get social housing and still can't in a lot of our areas. I tried like you, thinking, you know, perhaps they just don't know. I was seeing appalling inequality coming through my office, and I was actually every night leaving Parliament and going home and having a shower to try and wash the muck off me of my colleagues, and I'm broadly talking about the whole Parliament here because it was on everyone's watch. Everyone knew. And also the not-for-profits. I thought they would be supportive when I couldn't convince my own team members, so I sort of went public and said, you know, these are the issues. And what I found with not-for-profits is that they're funded by the governments and they're too frightened to stand up and call it as it is. And also, I found that the general public really, there were no votes in housing. I didn't get re-elected. I was called a rogue, a rebel, and a traitor and a treacherous bitch, all of those things. But to me, in 2018, I could see the huge homelessness problem we had here in Tasmania and the impact that has on kids going to school, getting fed, mothers having, you know, to raise a child in the back seat of a car, and eventually they're so exhausted they just can't send the kids to school. They can't clean their teeth in the public toilet, etc., etc. So I think Australia, after The Voice, has shown that we're a very divided country and we've got a lot of very selfish people.
I think it is important to touch on housing, and we have had some discussions today on housing. You know, it's a universal human right for children as well, and how it is that we're in this situation where we literally don't have enough houses for Tasmanians is extraordinary in itself. I think what often goes underestimated and unsaid is the impact that housing has on children in their own right. Not just the impact that it has on their family, which is how we often talk about it. We talk about housing and the impact on families. Well, children are citizens in their own right. They experience those impacts as individuals, and they're different, the impacts for them. And I would certainly like to see children more front and centre in the discussions around housing in Tasmania.
But what I'd like to do in this regard is to thank both Leanne and Anne for making the time to talk about these challenging, difficult and yet utterly significant issues. And so if we could give them a hand of applause. I'm almost expecting a standing ovation at that rate, but it's certainly my hope that the conversation won't finish within the confines of the space of this evening, and that the work that Leanne and Anne do as part of their offices and their hopes for the future of our children are animated through all of us. And to spook the next event in a couple of weeks' time on 21 November, either online or in the Medical Sciences Precinct in Hobart, Dr. Rosie Nash believes health literacy could be the answer to better health outcomes, less inequity, improved educational attainment and more productive Tasmanians. The question is she right? Well, to find out, you'll have to attend. Thanks for joining us this evening. On behalf of the University, I wish you a happy and safe evening.